The sun was setting over the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The air was thick with the heat of the day, and the desert stretched out endlessly, an ocean of sand and dust. Yet despite the harshness of this world, an alien princess stood at the edge of the desert, looking out into the vast unknown. Her name was Princess Lyra, and she was the heir to the royal throne of a distant galaxy. She had always been surrounded by luxury, servants, and everything she could ever want. Yet, despite her high status and the comforts of the palace, Lyra felt something was missing in her life. She longed for something real, something genuine. And that something, she realized, was her friend Ethan. Ethan was a human, and their friendship began years ago when he came to her world as an explorer. At first, Lyra had been cautious, unsure about forming a bond with someone from a different species. But Ethan had a kindness and bravery about him that quickly broke through her doubts. They had spent countless hours together, learning from each other, sharing stories, and even laughing at their differences. He had shown her a side of the universe that no one else could. But then one day, he had left for an expedition into the desert. He was supposed to return in a few days, but days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Lyra had not received any word from him. The palace had sent search parties, but no one could find any trace of Ethan. It was as though he had disappeared into the vast nothingness of the desert. Lyra could not sit by and wait any longer. She could not allow her friend to be lost forever. She had made up her mind. She would go to the desert herself, even if it meant facing the dangers alone. Early the next morning, Lyra stood in front of her palace gates. Dressed in simple but durable clothes, she had left behind her royal attire. She needed no crown or jewels to define her. She was determined to find Ethan, no matter the cost. With her were a handful of loyal guards, each ready to protect her. But Lyra was more than just a princess. She was a leader, and her determination was unshakable. "We will find him, Your Highness," one of her guards, a strong and experienced warrior named Captain Orcs, said. He bowed his head slightly, his eyes full of respect. "The desert is dangerous, but we will stick together. We won't be alone." Lyra nodded, grateful for his support, but deep down, she knew that this journey was something she had to do herself. The thought of Ethan being out there alone and perhaps in danger made her heart ache. They left the palace grounds and began their trek into the desert. The scorching sun beat down on them, and the sand beneath their feet felt like hot coals. But Lyra refused to let the harsh conditions stop her. She had faced challenges before, but this was different. This was personal. As they traveled deeper into the desert, the landscape became more unforgiving. The sand dunes towered over them, and the heat made it difficult to breathe. Every step felt like an effort, but Lyra pushed on, her eyes fixed. Ahead, she was determined to find Ethan, and she would not turn back. At night, they set up camp under the stars. The desert sky was clear, and the stars seemed to stretch on forever. It was a peaceful sight, but it only made Lyra feel more alone. The silence of the desert was both comforting and eerie. She lay awake for hours, thinking about Ethan. What had happened to him? Why had he not returned? She wondered if he was still alive, if he was somewhere out there, waiting for help. Captain Ark noticed her restlessness and approached her. "Your Highness, I know this is hard, but you are doing the right thing. Ethan would have done the same for you." Lyra sighed and sat up, gazing out into the distance. "I know, but I feel like I should have done more. Should have casting long shadows across the sand." It was then that she saw something, a small, dark figure in the distance. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Could it be Ethan? Without hesitation, she turned to her guards. "I think I see something," she said, her voice filled with hope. "Let's go. We need to find out." The group quickly gathered their gear and set off toward the figure on the horizon. Lyra's heart raced as they drew closer. She could feel it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment that would either confirm her fears or bring her the greatest joy. As they reached the figure, Lyra's breath caught in her throat. There, standing before her, was Ethan. His clothes were torn, and covered in dirt, but he was alive. His eyes lit up with surprise and relief as he saw her. "Lyra," he whispered, his voice weak but full of emotion. "You came for me." Lyra rushed forward, embracing her friend, overwhelmed with joy and relief. "I promised I would never leave you." "Behind," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm so glad you're safe." Ethan smiled weakly. "I knew you would find me." And in that moment, standing in the desert, Lyra realized that no matter how far they had traveled or how difficult the journey had been, it had all been worth it. She had found her friend, and nothing else mattered. The desert stretched out before Lyra like an endless sea of sand. The sun hung high in the sky, beating down with unforgiving intensity. The air shimmered with heat, and the soft sound of the wind blowing across the dunes was the only sound for miles. The harsh reality of the desert was something Lyra had never fully understood until now. Back in the palace, she had only heard stories of this unforgiving land. But now, standing on its sands, she felt its true power. Lyra and her guards had been traveling for days, and the journey had taken a toll on them. The scorching sun during the day left them all feeling drained, while the freezing cold at night made it impossible to sleep. Lyra was no stranger to hardship, but this desert tested her like nothing else. The fatigue was starting to show even on her most loyal guards. Captain Auric, ever the stalwart leader, remained strong. But his face had grown gaunt from the lack of rest. He still carried a sense of duty, but even he couldn't ignore the growing exhaustion. The other guards, usually full of energy, were now silent, each of them focused only on putting one foot in front of the other. "I didn't think the desert would be this tough," one of the guards muttered under his breath as they trudged along the dunes. Lyra, though weary, refused to let their spirits drop. She had led them this far, and she would lead them further. If there was one thing her time in the palace had taught her, it was how to face adversity with grace and determination. She was no stranger to challenges, and this desert was no different. Her resolve had not wavered. She would not allow the harsh conditions to stop her from finding Ethan. As the days passed, the desert seemed to shift, becoming more and more dangerous. The wind grew stronger, whipping up sandstorms that blotted out the sun and made it impossible to see. Lyra and her guards had to hold their cloaks tightly around them, shielding themselves from the biting sand. The air, thick with dust, made it hard to breathe, and each step felt like they were walking through a suffocating cloud. "We need to find shelter." Captain Eric called out over the roar of the wind. "The storm is getting worse," Lyra nodded, her eyes squinting as she scanned the horizon. There was no sign of shelter in sight, only miles and miles of shifting sand. But she refused to give in. "Keep moving." "We can't stop now," she said, her voice firm. She could see the exhaustion in her guards' faces, but they respected her determination and continued to follow her lead. After what felt like hours, the storm finally began to ease. The wind died down, and the sun broke through the clouds of sand, casting a warm glow over the desert. They had managed to find a small cave, just big enough for the group to huddle in. Lyra sat at the entrance, looking out over the desert. Her thoughts wandering, her mind kept returning to Ethan. She could not shake the feeling that he was still out there, waiting for help. But with each passing day, the chances of finding him seemed to shrink. What if he wasn't alive? What if the desert had taken him, as it had taken so many others? The thought weighed heavily on her heart, but she could not allow herself to entertain that fear. She had promised Ethan that she would find him, and she would keep that promise, no matter the cost. She had to believe he was still out there. As the night settled in, the temperature dropped rapidly. The cold winds howled outside, making the small cave feel like a refuge from the unforgiving world beyond. Lyra pulled her cloak tightly around her shoulders and sat by the fire, trying to warm herself. One of the guards, a young man named Yarick, sat beside her. He had been quiet since the storm, his eyes distant. Lyra glanced at him, sensing his unease. "Worried," she said softly. Yarick didn't meet her gaze, instead staring into the fire. I don't know how much longer we can keep going, Your Highness. The desert is brutal. We've been searching for so long, and we haven't found any sign of him. Lyra turned her gaze back to the desert, her thoughts swirling. She knew the journey was taking a toll on them all, but they couldn't stop now. "We have to keep going," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We're not giving up, not until we find him." Yarrick nodded, though his face remained clouded with doubt. "Of course, Your Highness." Lyra could see the fear in his eyes, the fear that they might be wasting their time, but she refused to give in to it. The desert might be vast, and the odds might be against them, but she knew that she couldn't let fear take over. Not now, not when she was so close. The next morning, they packed up quickly and continued their journey. The storm had passed, but the desert was still as harsh as ever. They moved in silence, the only sound being the crunch of their footsteps in the sand. The sun was already high in the sky, and the heat made it almost unbearable to walk. But Lyra didn't let the discomfort stop her. She couldn't afford to slow down. Hours passed, and they came to a small oasis. It was a rare sight in the desert, a patch of green surrounded by palm trees and a small pool of water. Lyra's guards, exhausted and parched, eagerly gathered around the pool, drinking deeply from the cool water. Lyra herself, though just as thirsty, hesitated. This was it. She could feel it in her gut. This oasis was where she would find the next clue. She took a deep breath and began to walk toward the far side of the oasis. Her guards, noticing her sudden change in direction, followed. Silently, Lyra's heart raced as she neared the edge of the water. She scanned the ground carefully, looking for any sign of Ethan, and then in the sand. She saw a faint set of footprints. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't much, but it was something. Ethan had been here. "Over here," she called. Out to her guards, her voice trembling with excitement. I missed the dial. We're getting closer. The hope that had been fading slowly returned, and with it, a renewed sense of purpose. The desert had been harsh, but now it was guiding her to her friend. She wasn't alone. Ethan was out there, and she was going to find him. The days in the desert seemed to stretch on endlessly, each one a struggle to keep moving. The once vibrant hope that Lyra had felt when she first set out on this journey was starting to fade. The sun, always high and unforgiving, drained her energy. The endless dunes, the never-ending stretches of sand, made it feel like they were going in circles, even though they were moving forward. With every passing day, the air became thicker, the sun fiercer, and the weight of uncertainty heavier on Lyra's heart. Despite her best efforts, doubt began to creep in. What if they were chasing a ghost? You're thinking about him, aren't you? Captain Eric's voice cut through the silence, pulling Lyra from her thoughts. Lyra looked at him, her face softening. She had always respected Eric, but right now there was something almost comforting in his quiet strength. "Yes," she admitted. "I keep wondering if we're too late." Eric stopped sharpening his sword and looked up at her. "Not too late, you won't be. You're a princess. Your strength and your resolve are unmatched. It's out there, I'm sure of it." Lyra nodded, but the words didn't reach her heart. They didn't banish the doubt that had settled there like a weight. What if Ethan was lost forever? What if she was chasing a hope that could never be fulfilled? "I don't know," she whispered, almost to herself. "I feel so far from home, from everything I know. It's like the desert is swallowing us whole." Arik stood and walked over to her, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes, princess, the desert is harsh. It tests us. But remember this, you've already come so far, and that's more than most people would ever do for a friend." Lyra met his gaze, his words stirring something deep within her. She had to keep going. She couldn't stop now. But in the quiet of the night, with only the stars overhead, the reality of her situation felt too much to bear. She had no idea if Ethan was still alive, or if the desert would ever give up its secrets. The uncertainty gnawed at her, and for a moment she just wanted to give up, to return to the palace where everything was safe and familiar. But then she remembered Ethan's smile, the way he always made her laugh, the warmth of their friendship. She remembered how he had always been there for her when she needed him the most. She couldn't give up. Not now. Not when she'd come this far. The next morning, as they packed up camp, Lyra's thoughts were heavy with doubt. But her resolve was stronger than it had been in days. She couldn't let fear take over. Not now. They had to keep moving forward. The desert was still as vast as ever, and the journey ahead seemed as uncertain as the night before. But Lyra didn't let the fear take root. She led her group forward, one step at a time, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of Ethan. The footprints she had found seemed to be fading, the tracks becoming more difficult to follow with each passing hour. As they walked, Lyra found herself slowing down. Heat of the day had already begun to set in, and the weight of the journey seemed to press down on her chest. Her legs ached, her throat was dry, and the wind kicked up sand into her eyes. Every part of her body begged for rest. But she couldn't stop, not yet. It was when she stumbled, her foot catching on a hidden rock beneath the sand, that she felt at the feeling that she was being watched. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She scanned the area around her, but there was nothing, just the empty desert stretching out before her. "Did you feel that?" Lyra asked, her voice barely a whisper. Eric, who had been walking beside her, looked around cautiously. "I didn't feel anything," he said, his hand moving to the hilt of his sword. But there was a sense of unease in his voice. They continued walking, but Lyra's senses were on high alert. The feeling didn't go away. It was like the desert itself was watching them, waiting for something. Lyra's thoughts raced. Could this be a sign that they were close to something? Or was it just the desert playing tricks on her mind, pushing her to the brink of exhaustion? As they walked further, the sand beneath their feet seemed to shift, the landscape changing slowly, but noticeably. Lyra's heart began to race again as she spotted something in the distance, a shadow. It was too far to make out, but it was there. Something was moving toward them. "Look," Lyra said, pointing to the horizon. Eric's eyes narrowed. Could be a mirage. But Lyra didn't think so. She could feel it. This wasn't a mirage. This was real. She turned to her guards. "Let's move quickly." They picked up the pace, walking with a new sense of purpose. The shadow grew larger, and Lyra could almost make out its shape. Was it a person or something else? As they got closer, the shape began to take form. It was a figure walking slowly toward them across the dunes. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. Was this it? Was this the moment she had been waiting for? Sun hung high in the sky, casting a harsh, unforgiving light over the desert. Lyra and her guards moved steadily through the sand, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of Ethan. The landscape seemed endless, with no end in sight. Each step they took felt like they were walking through a dream, a long and tiring journey with no clear direction. The doubts that had been gnawing at Lyra's mind grew stronger with each passing hour. But then, something caught her attention. A small, faint mark in the sand. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Lyra's heart race with hope. She stopped and knelt down, her fingers brushing the surface of the sand. It wasn't a footprint, least, not like the ones they had been following earlier. This was different, a deeper indentation, as though something had been dragged across. "The ground over here," Lyra called out to her guards, her voice full of urgency. "I think I've found something." Captain Arik, who had been walking just a few steps behind, rushed to her side. He knelt down beside her and studied the mark. "It's faint, but it's definitely not natural," he said, his voice filled with curiosity. "This might be a sign that Ethan passed this way." Lyra's pulse quickened. They had found something. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give her hope. She carefully followed the marks in the sand, her eyes fixed on the ground as they led her further into the desert. The others followed closely behind, her faces a mix of hope and uncertainty as they continued. The marks became more defined, and Lyra could feel her heart beating faster. She knew they were getting closer. She could feel it in her bones. There was something ahead, something important. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they arrived at a small, rocky outcrop. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the landscape. The air was cooler now, but the sense of urgency in Lyra's chest didn't lessen. She stepped forward, her heart pounding in her ears. The marks had led them to a hidden cave, partially obscured by rocks. Lyra's eyes widened in surprise. She hadn't expected to find something like this in the middle of the desert. The cave was small, but it looked like it had been used recently. There were signs of movement, disturbed sand, broken twigs, and a few pieces of torn cloth scattered on the ground. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. She stepped forward, carefully entering the cave. The air inside was cooler in the dim light. From the setting sun filtered in through the small entrance, she could hear the sound of her breath, steady but quick, as she looked around. "This is it," she whispered to herself. Ethan had been here. She moved further into the cave, her eyes scanning every inch of the space. And then, there it was, something that made her breath catch in her throat. A small, faded map, pinned to the wall with a simple stone. The map looked old, but it was clearly marked with several points of interest, one of which seemed to be located deep in the desert. Lyra reached for the map, her fingers trembling as she pulled it from the wall. She studied the markings closely, her mind racing. The map was detailed, showing different areas of the desert, but one location in particular stood out to her. It was marked with a symbol she recognized Ethan had drawn it once, long ago, when they were talking about their adventures. "This is it, Lyra," said her voice barely more than a whisper. This is where he went. Captain Orcs stepped into the cave behind her, peering over her shoulder at the map. This could be it. "We've been searching for days, but this map might be the key too." Finding him, Lyra nodded, a sense of relief washing over her. They had been searching for so long, but now they had a direction. They had a chance to find Ethan, to bring him back. But as she stood there, holding the map in her hands, a thought crossed her mind. What if Ethan had already left this place? What if he had moved on, thinking that no one would ever find him? The desert was vast, and Ethan was strong. But even he couldn't survive the endless sand and scorching heat forever. Lyra shook her head, pushing the thought away. She couldn't afford to think like that. Not now. She had to believe that Ethan was still out there waiting for her. She had come this far. She couldn't stop now. "We need to go," she said, her voice firm. "We have a direction now. We can find him." The guards nodded, their faces filled with renewed hope. They quickly gathered their supplies, ready to set off once more. The journey ahead would not be easy, but they were no longer aimlessly wandering. The desert? They had a goal. They had a plan. As the group made their way out of the cave and back into the desert, Lyra's thoughts were consumed with the map. It was their best chance, their only chance, to find Ethan. The sun had nearly set, but Lyra could feel the pull of the desert. Urging her forward, the stars began to appear overhead, shining brightly in the clear desert sky. Lyra paused. Moment, looking up at the constellations. She had always felt a deep connection to the stars. It reminded her of home, of everything she was fighting for. But tonight the stars felt different. Tonight, they were guiding her to something more. With the map in her hand and the desert at her back, Lyra felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was no longer alone. She had her guards, and she had the map. Most importantly, she had hope. The journey was far from over. Lyra was determined to find Ethan, no matter the cost. The desert stretched before Lyra and her guards, vast and unyielding. They had followed the map's markings for several hours now, and the sun was beginning to dip behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the sand. The temperature was dropping, and the cool night air felt like a relief after the scorching heat of the day. Despite their exhaustion, Lyra felt a renewed sense of purpose. They were getting closer to finding Ethan, and that thought kept her going. However, the desert had a way of testing even the most determined travelers. And as the night grew darker, Lyra's sense of unease grew. The silence of the desert felt heavier now, as though something was watching them. Her heart raced in her chest as she led the group forward, her eyes scanning the landscape for any sign of danger. The sand shifted underfoot, and the wind whispered around them, but there was an unsettling stillness to the air. "Stay alert," Captain Arik called out, his voice low but filled with authority. He had been with Lyra through many battles, but this felt different. The desert was unfamiliar, and every step they took felt like they were walking into the unknown. Lyra nodded, her senses heightened. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. It was as though the desert itself was preparing to reveal its secrets. And in that moment, she realized that they weren't alone. The ground beneath them suddenly trembled. It was a subtle shift at first, like a distant rumble, but it grew stronger with each passing second. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. She turned to look at her guards, their faces tense, their hands instinctively moving toward their weapons. The air felt charged, silence broken only by the sound of the ground shifting, before Lyra could react. A massive shadow loomed ahead of them, moving swiftly through the sand. It was too large to be a mirage. Something was out there, something fast and powerful. The ground continued to shake as the creature drew closer. "Get ready," Arik barked, his voice urgent. "Stay close to the princess." Lyra instinctively moved closer to her guards, her hand gripping the hilt of her sword. She had trained for moments like this, though she had never imagined facing such a creature in the desert. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. As the shadow grew larger and larger, and then, in an instant, the creature burst forth from the sands. Its enormous form emerging from the ground like a living nightmare. It was a giant armored beast covered in thick spiked plating. Its eyes glowed with an eerie light, and its massive jaws snapped open with a deafening roar. The creature towered over them, its body built for strength and speed. And it was clear that it was not afraid to use its power. Lyra's breath caught in her throat as she froze. Taking in the sight of the terrifying creature, it had the body of a massive lizard, but with sharp, jagged claws that scraped the ground as it moved. Its scales shimmered in the fading light, and its long tail whipped through the air, knocking over rocks with terrifying force. The creature let out a menacing growl, its teeth sharp and glistening. Lyra could feel the heat from its breath, and she instinctively took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. This was no ordinary desert animal. This was a predator, one that had lived in the desert for centuries, waiting for its next meal. "We have to fight it," Arik shouted, drawing his sword. His face was set in determination. He had faced many enemies in his time, but this creature was unlike anything he had ever seen. "Form a defensive line." The guards quickly positioned themselves around Lyra, forming a tight circle to protect her. The creature, sensing their fear, lunged forward with incredible speed, its claws slashing through the air. Arik blocked the attack just in time, his sword clashing against the creature's armored hide with a loud clang. The beast roared in fury, but Arik held his ground, refusing to give an inch. Lyra's eyes darted around, trying to find an opening, a weakness in the creature's defenses. She knew she couldn't just stand by and watch. She had to help. She had to do something. With a surge of courage, she lunged forward, her sword raised. She aimed for the creature's throat, where the scales were thinner, hoping to find a weak spot. But the creature was too quick. It spun around, knocking her aside with a powerful swipe of its tail. Lyra crashed into the sand, the wind knocked out of her lungs. For a moment, the desert seemed to fall silent. The creature staggered, its enormous body jerking as it struggled to stand. Lyra's hand shook from the effort, but she held her ground. Her eyes locked on the beast. With one final mighty roar, the creature collapsed to the ground, its body thudding against the sand. Lyra stood over it, panting, her heart still racing. It was over. They had won. But as the dust settled and the moon rose high in the sky, Lyra realized that the desert had just revealed one of its many dangers. Unforgiving land. And with each step they took, the challenges would only get harder. Lyra wiped the sweat from her brow, her sword still in her hand. "We keep moving," she said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion. "Ethan is waiting. For us." And with that, the group continued on, determined to face whatever else the desert might throw their way. The night had fallen completely. The desert stretched out under the moonlight like a vast, silent sea of sand. Lyra and her guards moved, cautiously, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. The battle with the creatures still lingered in their minds, but now, more than ever, they had to stay focused. They were so close to finding Ethan, and that thought alone kept them going. The journey had been long and dangerous, but now, the map and the clues pointing them in the right direction, they could finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. Lyra felt her heart pounding in her chest as they approached a rocky outcrop, the last landmark marked on the map. This was it. They had reached the place where Ethan had last been. The rocky formations loomed in the distance, casting long, eerie shadows across the desert floor. She could feel the weight of her anxiety pressing down on her, but she refused to show it. She had come so far, and she couldn't stop now. "Stay close," Lyra whispered to her guards. Her voice was barely audible in the stillness of the desert night, but it carried the urgency she felt. "Ethan has to be here." Captain Arik nodded, his face grim but determined. "We're with you, Princess. We'll find him." They moved forward cautiously, the moonlight casting their shadows long and thin across the ground. The air was still, and the only sound was the soft crunch of their boots in the sand. As they neared the outcrop, Lyra's heart rate quickened. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, that she was on the edge of something important. The wind picked up again, sweeping the sand around them in gentle waves. Lyra's eyes scanned the rocks carefully, looking for any sign that Ethan had been here. And then, just as she was beginning to doubt, she saw something, a faint trace in the sand, a sign that someone had passed this way recently. She bent down, her fingers brushing the marks. These were fresh, just hours old. The discovery sent a thrill through her. Ethan was close. She could feel it. "Over here," Lyra called, her voice steady but filled with excitement. Her guards gathered around her, and Captain Arik stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the tracks. "Definitely him," Arik said. "Let's move quickly." Renewed energy, they followed the tracks through the rocky terrain. Lyra's heart raced as they moved deeper into the outcrop. The shadows of the rocks seemed to stretch and twist, casting strange shapes in the moonlight. For a moment it felt like they were being swallowed by the desert itself. But Lyra kept her focus, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. They climbed over a series of boulders, carefully making their way through the narrow gaps. The rocks were steep and jagged, but Lyra didn't hesitate. She couldn't. Ethan was so close. She could feel it in her bones. As they rounded a corner, Lyra suddenly stopped. There, just ahead of them, standing at the edge of a small clearing, was a figure. A man. A human. Ethan. Her heart stopped. For a moment, she could hardly believe her eyes. After all the days of searching, of walking through the desert, of battling fierce creatures and facing doubt, she had finally found him. "Ethan," Lyra shouted. Her voice breaking the silence of the night. Ethan turned around slowly, his face covered in dirt and grime, his clothes torn from the harsh conditions of the desert. But his eyes, those familiar eyes, locked with hers, and a smile spread across his face. "Lyra," he whispered, as if he couldn't believe it either. "Is it really you?" Lyra ran toward him, her heart bursting with relief and joy. She reached him. In an instant, throwing her arms around him in a tight embrace, the warmth of his body, the familiar scent of him, made her feel as though she had been reunited with a part of herself that had been missing for far too long. "I can't believe it." "I thought I had lost you," Lyra said, her voice shaky with emotion. She pulled back slightly, looking at him with tears in her eyes. "I promised I would find you, Ethan." Ethan smiled, his face tired but relieved. "I knew you would. I never gave up hope either." Captain Arik and the other guards approached, but they kept their distance, giving Lyra and Ethan a moment to themselves. Lyra stepped back, still in disbelief that she had actually found him. "Where have you been?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "We searched for so long, we thought." "I know," Ethan interrupted softly, his voice rough from thirst. and exhaustion. I got separated from the group during an expedition, tried to find my way back, but the desert, it's unlike anything I've ever seen. I was lost, without food or water. I knew I had to keep going, keep trying to survive. But it's hard, Lyra. It's so hard out here. Lyra's heart ached as she listened to him. She could see the weariness in his eyes, the toll that the desert had taken on him. But despite everything, despite the odds, he was still alive. And he was here with her. "You don't have to worry anymore," Lyra said softly, her hand gently, touching his arm. "We're going to get you out of here. We're going home." Ethan nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I'm glad you came for me. I didn't think anyone would." Lyra shook her head, her heart swelling with affection. "Of course I came for you. You're my friend. I promised I wouldn't leave you behind, and I meant it." They stood there for a moment, just holding each other, grateful for the reunion that neither of them had thought would come. The desert had been harsh and unforgiving, but it had not broken their bond. After a few moments, Lyra pulled back, her eyes scanning the rocky landscape around them. "We need to get you back to the palace. You're safe now." Ethan nodded, looking at her with gratitude in his eyes. "I'm ready. Let's go home." With that, Lyra helped him to his feet, and together, with her guards by their side, they began the long journey back. The desert, once so vast and endless, no longer felt as daunting. They had overcome its challenges, and now they were finally going home. Lyra glanced up at the stars, the same stars that had guided her through the desert, and she smiled. The journey had been long, and the desert had been unforgiving, but she had kept her promise. She had found Ethan, and now they could return to the safety of their world, and nothing would ever be the same again. The stars shone brightly above as Lyra, Ethan, and the guards made their way back through the desert. The harsh journey was far from over, but the weight on Lyra's shoulders felt lighter now. She had found Ethan, and he was alive, standing beside her. That was all that mattered. The desert, which had once seemed like an endless maze of sand and danger, now felt less intimidating. Lyra's steps were lighter, her heart steadier. They still had a long way to go, but the hardest part was behind them. And as they walked together, side by side, the sense of hope that had carried them through the toughest moments of the journey filled the air around them. Ethan, though still weak from his time alone in the desert, walked with a renewed strength. His eyes, once filled with doubt and fear, now gleamed with something else, a quiet determination. He had survived, and now, thanks to Lyra, he was going home. "I never thought I'd see the day when I'd be walking out of the desert," Ethan said, his voice a little rough, but filled with gratitude. Lyra glanced at him, offering him a reassuring smile. "You're stronger than you think. The desert couldn't break you." Ethan smiled back, though there was a trace of sadness in his eyes. "I wasn't so sure at first. But then I remembered something. I remembered you." Lyra's heart fluttered at his words. She had always known that Ethan was strong, but hearing him say it out loud made her feel proud. He had fought through the desert alone, determined to survive, and now with her help, he would make it back. As they continued walking, the desert landscape began to shift. The sand dunes gave way to rocky hills and patches of dry, scrubby vegetation. The air felt cooler, a welcome change from the scorching heat they had endured for so long. And in the distance, Lyra could make out the faint outline of the palace, its towers rising above the horizon. They were almost home. "Almost there," Lyra said, her voice filled with quiet relief. "We've made it." Ethan looked ahead, his expression softening as he saw the familiar sight of the palace in the distance. He had always admired the beauty of the place, but now it felt like more than just a building. It felt like safety, a place where he could rest, recover, and find peace. It was a place where he could finally stop running. "It feels good, too." "See that again?" Ethan said, a sigh of relief escaping his lips. "It feels like a lifetime ago that I first set foot here." Lyra nodded, her eyes also drawn to the distant palace. "It has been a long journey, but we're almost home." As they drew closer, Lyra's thoughts turned to her people, the ones who had stayed behind at the palace. The journey had taken longer than she had anticipated, and she knew they would be worried. But the news of Ethan's survival would bring them comfort. They had feared the worst, but now they could rest easy, knowing that their princess had not only survived the desert, but had brought her friend home safely. When they finally reached the gates of the palace, the guards stationed there greeted them with surprised looks, their expressions softening into relief as they saw the princess and Ethan walking toward them. "Your Highness," one of the guards said, bowing deeply. "We were beginning to worry." Lyra smiled, her heart full as she stepped forward. "There's no need to worry anymore. We've made it back." The guard's eyes shifted to Ethan, who was walking beside her, still looking a little worn but very much alive. "Is this the explorer from the desert?" Lyra nodded. "Yes. This is Ethan. He's been through a lot, but he's back now." Ethan offered the guard a tired smile, nodding in return. "It's good to be back," he said, his voice stronger. Now, though still carrying the strain of the desert journey, as they entered the palace, Lyra's steps felt lighter, almost as if the weight of the desert had been left behind. The palace, with its marble walls and towering spires, welcomed them, like an old friend. Lyra couldn't help but feel a deep sense of comfort in the familiar surroundings. But she knew that this homecoming would be different. The journey had changed her, and it had changed Ethan. They had both learned something important along the way, that sometimes the greatest challenges brought the greatest rewards. Inside the palace, Lyra led Ethan to a quiet chamber where he could rest. The palace healer was Ku. For the first time in a long while, Lyra felt at peace. She had completed her mission, brought her friend home, and proven to herself that she was stronger than the desert. There was nothing that could break her now. The future was uncertain, but it was also full of possibility. Together, Lyra and Ethan would face whatever came next. They had conquered the desert, and they had conquered their doubts. They were stronger for it, and now they were ready to embrace whatever new challenges lay ahead, knowing that as long as they had each other, they could face anything.